Okay. So today, a more detailed title, I guess. We're going to cover just an overall floodplain mapping update for the state, what DNR has going on currently, and what we're proposing to do moving into the future. Kind of a summary of our business plan, but getting into the weeds a little bit more. This is basically our effort to provide updated flood risk data throughout the state. And we understand it's slow and it can be painful, but we're getting there. Just as a recap, the Floodplain Management Division is housed in the Department of Natural Resources. Our mission is to prevent the loss of life and damage to property in Nebraska due to flooding. We do this by coordinating an overall program that's aimed at addressing the wise use of land that is subject to flooding. Our responsibilities are to provide floodplain management technical assistance to local, state, and federal agencies. We are also the state coordinating office for the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. We identify and delineate floodplains and floodways. We have statutory requirements to do so, but we do a lot of this in partnership with FEMA now. We provide technical assistance for development of local flood hazard mitigation plans, and we administer FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant. So if you're looking for FMA funding when the NOFOs come out in the fall, we're the agency that you would contact for that particular grant. Our current staffing, we have 6 engineers, 1 vacancy right now, an entry-level vacancy. So if you know anyone interested, send them our way. We have 5 GIS technicians that are doing mapping work, 3 outreach coordinators, including our state NFIP coordinator, Elijah Kaufman, 2 NFIP specialists, and 1 administrative assistant, Michelle. She's way more than an administrative assistant. She's the one that runs the show here. So 5 staff members are primarily working on that NFIP coordination, outreach, technical assistance. They're the Elijahs, Annas, Aarons of the world. We have 2 vacancies right now. One of those, of course, due to Chuck Chase retiring. And then the other one is because of Elijah's promotion. We have 10 staff members that work primarily on mapping and again have that 1 vacancy in the engineering position. So, 10 people to do statewide mapping, that's a pretty big undertaking. So you can see why it can sometimes take us a little bit of time. Plus, there's also the funding aspect of that that we'll talk through a little bit later. 2 staff members split their time between the 2, and that's primarily me and Michelle. Okay, so we're going to dive into the floodplain mapping side of our team. We conduct our mapping through FEMA's Cooperating Technical Partners Program. And this program basically, FEMA used to do all of the mapping on their own, and they realized that they didn't always have a good handle on how to best engage the local communities. So they found creating this CTP program that they could partner with states and communities to better engage the area in the mapping process and to make sure that the results were making sense. So it wasn't just the federal government coming in and forcing a map on you. You had some say in what was going on and had some ability to review the work and see some familiar faces that were going to be around to answer questions afterwards. As a CTP, one of the things that we have to do every year is complete a multi-year business plan. And we're required to show at least 3 years into the future. We typically are showing at least 5. Just the way that the projects work, it's really easy to show 5 or more. Not to say that that business plan does not change every single year, because it does for a number of reasons. It can change because the funding has changed. This year was probably the most stressful year of business planning that I've had in my 8 years at DNR, because we did not have a federal budget until our business plan was already done. So it changed immediately afterwards because we didn't get everything that we asked for, because the federal budget was a little lower than it had been in previous years. But it can also change because FEMA priorities change, DNR priorities change. Maybe we've had a major flood event that have impacted areas, so we have to refocus our efforts somewhere else in the state than what we were originally planning. The business plan is available on our website. There's a PDF, so if you're ever curious about what we're up to and what we're planning, it is available in the document. It's most of the helpful information is at the back in the form of images showing what we're asking for and a workload map, which you'll see the workload map here later. State mapping priorities. So I mentioned earlier that by state statute, we have to produce and perform floodplain mapping. So we prioritize those needs based on the potential for future development, the potential for flood damage or loss of life, um, probability that adequate data and maps will be prepared within a reasonable time by other sources. So if someone else is going to do the work and we can take their work and leverage it towards getting it onto a FEMA firm panel, we will do that. The availability and adequacy of existing maps. Anyone on the line that's in the Elkhorn areas know that 2 significant flood events have caused those maps to be very outdated and in some areas almost unusable. So we try to prioritize areas like that to get new maps because we know how difficult they are to use. The availability of flood data and other information that we would need to produce new maps. So a big push from FEMA after we got statewide LIDAR was to update all of the maps so that they were LIDAR based. We clearly aren't there yet, but we are seeing really good results from the LiDAR-based mapping, significantly better than what we had when we were using the less finite or less fine detailed topographic data. And then the degree of interest that's shown by the local governments, because again, we don't want to just walk in and force a map on you. We certainly are going to go to an area that needs a new map because they're impossible to use and they're really hard for us on the technical assistance side to help you through that process. So it might feel like that is forced upon you. I promise that you will have a say in it. You will have lots of opportunity for comments. And of course, if you know us, you have all of us available to answer any questions or concerns that you have along the way. These mapping projects can take a very long time. So you will likely get sick of hearing about a mapping project that it doesn't feel like is moving very quickly, but just know that we're here and can answer questions as we're moving through that process. But we do want you to be interested in having new maps and want you to be engaged in that process, because if you as the local voice for floodplain management are engaged and active in the project, we will be more successful in getting the residents of those areas engaged and active in the project as well. And we want people to know what their flood risk is. We want them to be able to make safe choices. We want them to be able to find a new home that's not in a risky area. So the more that our message is spread out there, the better. Now, FEMA prioritizes mapping in a different way than we do. And it's changed even in the last couple years. They also have to do, it's not a business plan. I think they call it a strategic plan, or they have some name. FEMA has lots of plans, but in that plan, the most recent one was released last year, I think, or the year before. They're working hard to address gaps in flood risk data across the country. So they want unmapped areas to be mapped. They want paper counties, paper communities to be updated to have digital data. And really, they're working to try and have coverage nationally to assist the National Flood Insurance Program in doing the other side of the job, not the mapping side, but the enforcement, the managing development side, to make sure that communities and developers are making sound and safe decisions. So they also want to consult with and empower communities to reduce their flood risk. This is where their mitigation programs come in, their mitigation planning. They're really wanting communities to understand where their risk is and try and come up with strategies to decrease risk so that we become more resilient as a nation. They want to lead and support states, local, and tribal communities to engage in that risk-based mitigation planning. Um, that's a lot of words. But again, they're trying to eliminate risks to life and property from not just flooding, but all natural hazards through that hazard mitigation planning effort. They want to provide a sustainable and modern IT portfolio, and anyone that is familiar with the existing portfolio probably could laugh at that. But they are putting a lot of money into upgrading their IT systems. So hopefully it will be easier for the data to be accessed, shared. But more to come on that, hopefully later this year. There's supposed to be a pretty big update coming. And then they want to support enhanced risk reduction decision making by aligning risk map, which is their mapping program delivery, with whole community customer centric engagement and products. So that's very FEMA lingo. You can tell it was copied directly from their plan. Additional considerations that we at DNR take into account are prioritizing finishing active projects. Like I said, these projects take many years to complete from start to finish. So when we initiate a watershed, we want to make sure that we're getting to the finish line in that watershed in as timely of a manner as possible. That can get thrown off pretty easily. You know, we have a flood year. This year has been pretty active on the flood side of things so far, and we're still early into the summer and storm season, and that can delay us. I wouldn't say this year has so far, but 2019 certainly had an impact on our team. Utilizing updated technologies. So starting in FEMA fiscal year 2023, our mapping team transitioned to all 2D modeling and mapping, which is the most up-to-date technology. We're using LiDAR-based mapping. So there will be some challenges as we move forward because we might be a little bit ahead of FEMA in utilizing the technology and trying to get it on a regulatory map. And we certainly know that there will be challenges in our ice affected areas because there is not currently methodology in two-dimensional modeling to do that. So we will be working with FEMA to determine our path forward on that. But you'll also see that a lot of the watersheds that are in need of that type of information have also been delayed a little bit, just so that we can give FEMA time and ourselves time to figure out the methodology so we're not jumping into the deep end and have no path forward. Locations of recent floods. Of course, you know, when we have sand bed movable streams like the Elkhorn and the Platte, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing those areas if they've had recent floods and it causes their maps to be outdated. We don't want regulatory maps that have the river channel outside of the floodplain and floodway, because that's not a usable map for local floodplain management. And then we also want to provide uniform and easy to use data. The great thing about risk map and the transition from jurisdictional boundary mapping to this watershed approach that we do now is that we don't have those mismatches like we had before. We might see some mismatches on regulatory data as we're working through the process to update everything in that watershed. But we have mechanisms in place so that when we're finished with a whole watershed, the data will be seamless and you won't be able to tell that there was a county line in the middle of a mapping project, because water doesn't care about county lines, and mapping that way was really difficult. So I do really like the way that we're moving forward. So I've talked a little bit about risk map. Risk map is what FEMA calls the type of work that we're doing. It's risk mapping, analysis, and planning, because everything that FEMA does has to have an acronym. There are 4 different phases in a risk map project, and they are funded separately. So back in the previous generation of mapping, where we were doing jurisdictional mapping, it was what they called map modernization. They funded projects from start to finish. So you would have all of your engineering all the way to an effective map They don't do that through risk map. We start with a process that is called discovery. It's not a process, it's a phase. But discovery is basically just looking at the current and historic flood related data to get a picture of the area's flood risk. This is done at a watershed level, mostly the Huck 8, but we can do it at other areas. For those of you not familiar with the Huck 8 watersheds, it's a USGS designation. Pretty common terminology in the world that we're working on, but I can certainly send you information on the different Hucks that are in our area if you want them. Discovery also includes some mapping work now in the form of base level engineering, or now in Nebraska, 2D base level engineering. And this is just really quick. It's supposed to be really quick modeling, mapping, just to get a feel for whether or not the regulatory data needs to be updated. In Nebraska, because we do our mapping in-house, which is unique across the CTP program, there are only 2 states that do mapping in-house, us and Indiana. But because we do mapping in-house, we tend to know the areas that need new maps because we're doing BFEs, we're helping answer questions on the maps. So we already kind of have an idea before we even start doing any of that discovery phase work where we need new maps. So discovery is just kind of checking a box for FEMA. But there are some really helpful steps that we can go through during discovery, and it does start that engagement process with communities. And we develop a report, which this year has been simplified to some degree. So it's not just a 300-page document that you have to sort through and try and figure out. We've toned down some of that, and hopefully it's useful information going through risk and mitigation options. I think we even summarized some of the information on the mitigation actions that were identified in the hazard mitigation plan for the area. But discovery is supposed to take a year. And at the end of that year, we have a discovery meeting with the entire watershed and go through all of the findings. And we also go through that initial mapping to show the local jurisdictions what potential map updates will look like. Our 2D base level engineering in Nebraska is very close to what Zone A mapping will be. We are approaching it as like step 1 of Zone A mapping, and we'll make some refinements to that during data development. But by and large, what you see during the discovery phase will be fairly similar in Zone A areas to what we see during the data development phase. So data development is the second phase that's funded. That is the engineering that we do behind the scenes for mapping work. So it would include the hydrology, hydraulics, floodplain mapping. So figuring out how much water is getting to different areas within the watershed, how deep that water gets at different flood recurrence intervals. And then we do the mapping. And at the end of, there are a couple different phases or steps in data development where we're engaging with communities. We have a kickoff meeting. We also have at the very end a flood risk review meeting. And at the flood risk review meeting, that's where we show you the final draft boundaries at the end of that phase, and allow you to comment on them at that point. So anytime during discovery and data development, once you have seen boundaries, those boundaries are not final. So if you are provided an opportunity to review and comment on those boundaries, we highly suggest that you do that, because we can make modifications to the engineering, the data, the mapping at that point if something looks wrong. Once we move into this third step, the preliminary phase, we lose all options in our house of making those changes for you, and it becomes a cost on your end to make updates to boundaries and mapping issues, short of like really minor things like a road name being wrong. So that preliminary data development for us, we schedule somewhere between 1 to 2 years, depending on the area and how complex the modeling and mapping is. Recently, it's been pushing closer to 2 years. But we move into preliminary, that's scheduled to take a year, and that is just preliminary map creation. So the firm panel that you see, it's just a preliminary version of that. And then we start going through this whole process of following the Code of Federal Regulations and due process requirements in that preliminary and post-preliminary phase. Preliminary, like I said, takes a year. And now FEMA uses an automated mapping tool to produce those panels. So we don't even have much control over what a panel looks like anymore. We do our best to make them look as pretty as they can possibly look, but they certainly look different and a little messier than they looked in the past using the automated mapping tool. And then post-preliminary, so preliminary a year, post-preliminary is at minimum 18 months, just defined by the different steps in the Code of Federal Regulations and the timing between those. So if everything goes perfectly, you have a year for discovery, 2 years for data development, a year for preliminary, and then you're talking close to 2 years for post-prelim. So you're talking 5 years. 5 to 6 years. Best case scenario would probably be 4.5 to 5 years. It's important to note, though, that while our process is a little bit different than what anyone would be going through if they were doing just a map change or physical map revision, those post-preliminary steps are required anytime a floodplain or a floodway boundary is changed. So no matter what, it's going to take the amount of time that it takes just based on the regulations. And they're required for all of those different map changes, whether it's PMR, LOMAR, risk map project, paper inventory reduction. They're all the same time frame. It's that minimum of 18 months, no matter what. So now we'll get into the discussion on what we are up to on the mapping side and what our plan is for the future. One of the initiatives that FEMA has really put a heavy emphasis on in the last couple years is nationwide 2D coverage. And this stems from some changes that they're wanting to make to the mapping program and also to the NFIP to move to a more risk-based approach where it's not a line that's in or out, but maybe it's a gradient. It is something that they think is going to be coming very fast. It's something I think may not be coming as fast as they think. But we have agreed to start the process of getting statewide 2D coverage. And we're doing that in a couple different ways. We're doing that through 2D BLE projects and through our data development. So in areas that we had previously done 1D modeling or 2D modeling for BLE, we are moving forward with the 2D modeling for data development rather than taking a step backwards. So on this map, you'll see, if you can see my cursor, in FY23, which would have been the year that started October 1st for us, we initiated all of the Republican, and that was 2D BLE. And then we are doing data development in Turkey and the upper piece of Middle Big Blue. So we have a lot of enhanced miles in the Middle Big Blue. So we felt like it was a more straightforward watershed than, say, the Elkhorn, because the blue is a little more stable, a little less subject to moving, but also would give us a really good taste of what it was going to take on the enhanced modeling side in two-dimensional modeling. You'll see that we have existing 2D BLE in Salt, Little Nemaha, Cave Weeping Water. So those projects are wrapping up. The boundaries are on our interactive map. In the Salt watershed, it will not include the City of Lincoln. The City of Lincoln is their own CTP, and they are doing their own mapping work. So in 24, we had intended to initiate 2D BLE in all of the Niobrara, but we didn't get it all. So we're doing Cheyenne, White, and 2 little Huck 8s in the Niobrara, the Headwaters and Snake. And then we'll be doing actual data development in Middle North Platte and Middle North Platte, Scottsbluff. And then we're going to finish out the lower portion of Middle Big Blue, and then this is Upper Big Blue, to hopefully move into regulatory products for Gage County. And then you'll see that we're kind of sequencing through big watersheds. So we'll get the rest of 2D BLE. Anytime that you're seeing the big Huck 6 watershed, which is like this big guy, this one, those are our 2D BLE projects. And then any of the smaller Huck 8s, like these ones that I'm pointing out, this one is a bigger Huck 8, but those are all our data development projects. So in 25, we'll finish out the Niobraras. In 26, we move to the Loop, and then we'll go to the Elkhorns, and we'll finish out with the kind of stragglers here on the end, where we've already done recent data development, quote unquote recent, in the Blues and the Nemahas and Lewis and Clark Lake. And then Papio Missouri River NRD is also a CTP. So they are responsible for doing mapping in their jurisdiction. So they are sequenced last in our business plan for the reason that there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen, but also with the Platte River, it made the most sense to move from upstream to downstream, and they would be at the end of that sequencing anyway. So you'll see that we're not really getting into the Platts until the start of FY27, which would be October 1st, 2027, assuming that we get funding for everything before that. And then we will move through the entire Platte River together. And our intent is the 2D BLE will be contracted work until we get to the Platte. And then our plan is that we'll start doing the 2D BLE and do all of the Platte in-house. Okay, so to talk not just about 2D coverage, but to talk about the mapping that's going on and what it means for the different areas. This map has different colors depending on what phase of work we're in. So this will be the work, this will include our workload starting October 1st of 2024. So we haven't started all of this work, but FEMA has basically committed to funding the projects that are shown on this map if they weren't previously funded, which some of them were. So the existing projects would be Turkey and the upper piece of Middle Big Blue. Those are continuing data development. So we'll be finishing the engineering hopefully next year, within the next year. And everything else is, the Republican was an FY23 project too, that's 2D BLE, but all of the other stuff was old. The yellow is all old because it's regulatory. And then all of the other colors will be new in 24. So we will be refining some data development in Custer. The Middle North Platte Scottsbluff watershed, we had done BLE out there in 2018 and had some mixed results. So we're going to revisit that area and get some better, it's not better, but we just have better technology in HECRAS now that allows for better modeling and mapping in this part of the state. So we're going to update that so that we can update Scottsbluff County and get rid of that paper map. So you'll see that starting in October, we'll be doing 2D BLE in Cheyenne, Upper White, Niobrara, Headwaters, and Snake. We'll be continuing our efforts in the Republican, data development in Middle North Platte Scottsbluff, Turkey, and Middle Big Blue, refining data development in Custer County, and then all of these that are in yellow are either in prelim or post prelim. So the projects that are prelim right now are Kearney, Knuckles, Thayer, and Wayne. Dixon will be following here shortly. Cheyenne and Dual have already been issued prelim maps. We are getting very close to issuing prelim in Bayard and Bridgeport. Those are just community paper maps that are being updated. And Boone, Box Butte, and Sheridan and Cedar are the next round that will be happening. After we finish the first phase of work in FY24, so that October 1st, we'll then be passing on Johnson and Pawnee County. So Box Butte, Sheridan, Johnson, Pawnee are going to be the newest ones. They don't have prelim. They'll be prelim probably next fall. Late 2025, we'll say. So the way that our workload map is set up, it just adds the projects as we're adding them to the next fiscal year. So each grant year, we are allowed 4 years to finish a project. Some of them will take the full years, most of them will not. So you'll see that there's a lot of mapping that gets added, and then pieces slowly start to get removed as we finish the work. So the Republican, since it was our first large scale 2D BLE project, we did schedule that out to last most of the period of performance. So you'll see that one show up on the map for a while, and it gets a little overwhelming to us that are in the the world of doing the mapping, because we'll have mapping going on in a lot of the state as we move through this. So in 25, the only thing that really changes is we're adding the rest of the Niobrara and for the 2D BLE project, and then we will be adding data development for the Upper Elkhorn. So this is the first year that we'll be initiating that work. And then you'll see that the only other addition is that Custer County will be working through preliminary phase mapping. In 26, we will be adding the loop as our 2D BLE area. And this is where our mapping team, their heads kind of explode, because we have a lot of mapping going on, a lot of modeling, but they're all sequenced a little bit differently. So it's possible that we may even be through much of the Republican by this timeframe anyway. You'll see that we added preliminary for Scotts Bluff, and then we were done with data development in the Turkey and Middle Big Blue. So we'll have Fillmore, Saline, and Gage County that are also working towards preliminary map. And then the next year in FY27, you'll see the Republican is done. We still have ongoing projects up here in the Niobraras, the Cheyenne and Upper White. The loop is still ongoing, but we will be adding the remainder of the Pumpkin and Horse watersheds to finish out that piece, and then the South Platte and Lower North Platte for the 2D BLE. And then the data development that we're adding for in-house staff is North Fork Elkhorn, and then the upper piece of the Lower Elkhorn. We split the Lower Elkhorn up because there are a lot of levees in that watershed, and we know that the levees are going to be a little different in how they are handled in 2D modeling. And I'm not sure that FEMA has even sorted out exactly what that's going to look like. So we wanted to give those communities a lot of time to plan ahead what they needed to do, and so that we could better engage with those levied communities so that we can help them walk through what needs to happen and when. In 27, you'll see that we finish everything in the north and western part of the state. Since we're doing the 2D BLE in the South Platte and Lower North Platte in-house, we gave ourselves a couple years to get through that, and added the Middle Platte so that we can make sure that we're tying data in. We will start the Upper Elkhorn preliminary. Up here, you'll see Rock, Holt, Antelope, and Pierce will all be working toward preliminary map development. And then for data development, we're adding in the lower portion of the Lower Elkhorn. And in 29, then we'll start working our way through that upper piece, the North Fork Elkhorn and Lower Elkhorn, to update regulatory maps, which is very exciting for us because we have a lot of paper inventory in the Elkhorns, and I am so very excited to get to the point where we can get rid of those paper maps. And I'm sure that the floodplain administrators agree with me. And then you'll see that we will be continuing our efforts in data development in the lower Elkhorn, the lower pieces of that with those levied communities again. And then we will be starting the plat for data development, which is different than what business plans in the past had shown. We hadn't planned to initiate the plat quite that soon with the question marks that we have on the ice impact, but we'll have the same issue with the Elkhorns, and we're working through that with FEMA and having some discussions with the Corps of Engineers as well. So if you go to this drop down and select the flood awareness or the effective paper map, the Scottsbluff County map should show up. And it's important to note in the paper, the effective paper map layer, for communities that have separate floodplain and floodway maps, there aren't many, but there are a few. It will only show the floodplain. It does not show the floodway boundary map. So you'd have to go to the Map Service Center and download that separately. I know West Point is one community that has that, and we have a list of a few others. There aren't many, but it's very confusing because we aren't able to load both and have them legible. Yeah, so there's the paper map layer. It's very ugly, which is why we're so excited to get rid of it. So the preliminary in Scottsbluff shouldn't be showing anything because we're pulling in FEMA's layer and there's nothing, there shouldn't be anything even close to prelim there. We would have data in the prelim layer for Cheyenne County. If that layer is working, FEMA's layers don't always work right now. And it's still broken. Okay, so this is a good tutorial. In this prelim layer, we have reset this probably 15 times, but it'll show the panel number and it defaults to have the boundary, but it doesn't have the zone. So you have to check the zone to get them to fill in. And I don't know why it keeps reverting back to an old version, but so this is what the preliminary would look like. Is it possible in Scottsbluff County that maybe you were thinking of a BFE determination rather than a preliminary boundary? Because those would also be available on here. And they would just show up as orangish yellow boxes wherever we have one. Must not have very many in Cheyenne County. Yeah, so these boxes are the valid BFEs that you can download. Is that maybe what you were thinking?
She says, no, the BFEs still show the preliminary boundaries on the downloads.
So it's a layer that's showing on the BFE determination?
Correct.
Oh, we do have flood awareness area in Scottsbluff County that's likely being used in our BFEs. Because there was a mapping project that we were planning to move forward with in Scottsbluff. But they had a new version of HECRAS that was released that we can include infiltration in some of the areas in the northern part of the county in particular. So we wanted to update the models and mapping so that we could account for infiltration so that the boundaries weren't quite as large as what they're showing. So there is flood awareness area, but it's not moving into a preliminary yet. We are going to do another round of data development refinement in that whole watershed, and then we'll be moving into preliminary after that. Oh, you missed the flood awareness areas. Yes, we pulled them down just because we know that they're going to change and we didn't want people to be confused on what they were seeing. Hopefully we'll have some up for you though, mid to late next year, because we'll start that work in October. Any other questions? Well, this is contact information for the group. This is our NFIP coordination group mostly. But all of the contact information for the mapping staff is available on our website too. So feel free to reach out to anyone with any questions. Yeah, with that, thank you so much for attending. I appreciate your time. And like I said at the beginning, I could talk about this in my sleep. So if anyone ever wants to learn more about it or has any specific questions, feel free to reach out.